I want to welcome you to another First Friday event here, sponsored by the Town of Woodside's Arts and Culture Committee. It's been over 14 years since we started the committee and have been doing these programs. I know some of you, this may be your first Friday, but hopefully not your last. It's an exciting way for us to bring different presenters to the community, whether it be musical, authors on historical events like this evening, or world events, things like that. We've had poetry, literature, so it's a well-rounded experience that we'd like to provide. In fact, next month, we have the local school jazz band coming, so we'll have more music next month for you. And as always, our programs are available on our YouTube channel the Monday following the event. You'd be surprised how many people like to relive the experience by going through and enjoying the YouTube video again. Now, the town of Woodside has a lot of great organizations and committees that the town is involved with, from recreation to the equestrian community. So if you have spare time and you're looking for an activity, take a look at the town website and see if there's a committee that might have your interest and that you might want to be a part of. So this evening, we are very fortunate to have Mitch with us yet again. And he is from the San Mateo County HistoricalAssociation, and he's going to be talking about some of the interesting things, some of the rogues and little odd people that have come across our areas here. You know, it's interesting because Mark Twain said, politicians and diapers should be changed regularly and for the same reason. And for those of you who might have been following some of our local politics in the Almanac or other newspapers, you can see that the tradition of scallywags and rogues continues perhaps today. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Mitch Postel, thank you.
Well, thank you for all being here, and thanks to Terry Butler for asking me again. San Mateo County Historical Association Board of Directors is supporting me tonight in the form of Susan Lang, who's here. And setting everything up for us is our curator, Jenna Kimberlin. Tonight we're going to be talking about the political beginnings of San Mateo County. And it's interesting that in 1850, when California became a state, San Mateo County was not one of the original counties. It didn't become a county until 1856. This was a very sparsely settled part of the San Francisco Peninsula. 1847, the year before the American takeover of California, there were only about 500 people that lived south of San Francisco and north of San Francisco Creek. And that was a decrease in population from the time when the natives had it. So when the Ohlone people were in vogue and still having their Aboriginal lifestyles on the peninsula, there was as many as 2,500 people living here. So this was a decrease in population, and that, of course, the mission system was very hard on the natives. So they didn't do well in the colonial system. And when the explorers first came this way in 1769, every time they came upon a creek on the coast side, there was a village. And then when they got to the ridge that separated the bayside from the ocean side, they talked about the many smokes. And what they were talking about was the campfires of the native peoples. And they were quite numerous compared to other places. You know, the Indian people, just in general, of Central California, had the densest population of all the indigenous people in North America. You know, there were, upon contact, we say contact, that's when the Spanish came on the scene. Upon contact, there were about 300,000 California Indians. I know you might think, well, California's got, what, 40 million now, so that doesn't sound like a lot. But if you added up all the Indians of the Great Plains, the Kiowa, the Comanche, the Sioux, the Arapaho, all of them together, 250,000. So this was pretty densely populated. But anyways, by 1847 on our peninsula, estimated about 500 families during the Mexican regime. Now in 1860, which was the first year in which the census reflected San Mateo County's population, there were 5,300 people in San Mateo County. I found that really interesting this morning because I looked up Woodside, and guess what the population is? 5,300. So think for a minute about the population of Woodside stretched out from Daly City to Año Nuevo, from Brisbane to East Palo Alto, and you get a sense for really how sparsely settled this part of the world still was. And it's kind of demonstrated by this drawing by a pretty skilled artist named William Dougal, who in 1850 did this rendering of El Camino Real at Belmont, just about where Ralston intersects, Highway 82. Isn't it, you think about that intersection now, and if you've ever been stuck in traffic, then you know from what I'm talking about. Actually, right here in the Woodside area was the greatest concentration of people because it was right in the center of the county's first industry, and that was logging. The lumber mills were numerous, and in the Skyline and Woodside area, there was quite a bit of activity. And so we have a scene of some of the original residents of the Woodside area. That's the one on the left. Isn't that Bill Butler? Is that? And then the one. And certainly, I don't know if that's Bill, but certainly the one that's on the right, leaning against the log there, that's got to be Larry Ellison, isn't it? Larry never held a job in his life. So logging was supreme in this area. And I love this picture because and this was taken in the Bear Gulch area. All know Bear Gulch. And so you got the bullwhacker. He's the one that's got the kind of the whip thing there, the rod. And so he was kind of in charge of the crew. And then the guys with the pails, the guys with the buckets there, those were the grease monkeys because they would grease these logs, you see where the oxen are stepping over the log. So those were the skids. So they would grease the skids so as the oxen were bringing the logs down, and, it'd be easier on the animals. And so these became known as skid rows. So what was the object of all this cutting down on the old growth redwood trees? Well, San Francisco was a burgeoning city, and it was made of wood, mostly wood and canvas. And there wasn't a lot of water there, so when a fire hit, it was a disaster, and the city had to be rebuilt. In 1851, San Francisco burns down 6 times. And each time, to a certain extent, it's rebuilt, bigger and better. But a lot of the construction material, a lot of the redwood that's used to help build the city comes from right here, Woodside and Skyline areas. Strikingly different from down here on the peninsula where that was so sparse, what was happening in San Francisco. By 1856, the year that San Mateo County would become a county, San Francisco is a growing, pulsating city of 50,000. And it's because of the gold rush. And it was becoming the most important city on the Pacific slope in North America. The peninsula was part of San Francisco County. And we were represented up in San Francisco by 3 supervisors in 1850 in that first year. One was a man named John Treat, who was a 28-year-old farmer. Another was this man, Francisco Sanchez of the old regime. In fact, his father had come with the Anza expedition in 1776, the original party to settle at San Francisco during the Spanish colonial times. As leader during the Mexican era, Sanchez was awarded the 9,000-acre Rancho San Pedro, which was basically Pacifica of today. And this is the first rendering of his home, which still stands. in Pacifica and is operated as a history museum by our San Mateo County Historical Association. Sanchez rose to various important posts under the Mexican regime. He was Comandante de Presidio, and at times he was alcalde, or mayor of Yerba Buena, and that was the first name for San Francisco. During the Mexican-American War, he led the Californians against American Marines at the Battle of Santa Clara. Unlike other rancheros, he maintained his rancho deep into the early American period, remaining one of the most wealthy residents of early San Mateo County until he fell off his horse and died in 1862. You all recognize this guy. This is R.O. Tripp, who was the third of the three supervisors. And Sanchez and Tripp really symbolize how California was changing. Sanchez representing the old, Tripp representing the new. Because California would become a place from a society of friends and neighbors. You know, there were only about 500 families in all of California that were calling the shots, 500 rancho families. It was a society of neighbors and friends to a world of new and transient people, all these gold seekers. Before the gold rush, there were only about 6,500 Californians in the entire state, and they were completely outnumbered in just 1 year in 1849 by 90,000 Argonauts. And each year thereafter, similar numbers of new people were coming through. So they were completely outnumbered. And so this became a place that at one time had an agricultural-based economy to one that was based on mining. They went from a bartering system to commerce that was based on gold. They went from Spanish language to English. They went from Catholic to Protestant. And so the differences were seismic. This is R.O. Tripp, of course, who was born in Newport, New York in 1816. By the time he got to California, he was already 34 years old, and that was old. He was an old man compared to most of the Argonauts. He's trained to be a dentist back east. He came to California in 1849 because of the gold rush, like everybody else. And he opened a practice in San Francisco extracting teeth for $4 each. He plugged teeth for $8. The unethical practices of his colleagues and the warmer climate of the peninsula encouraged him to find an occupation down south. He decided to get into the lumber business with a partner named James Ryder. Their plan was to farm out lumber in the Woodside area to build the wharves at San Francisco. In 1850, they found access to the bay at Redwood City, and thus Ryder and Tripp become the unknowing founders of both Woodside and Redwood City. The logs at Redwood City were tied together and loaded up to San Francisco in rafts. Now, Ryder became famous for being mauled by a grizzly bear and living through it. And maybe that's what made him famous. His name for forever after was Grizzly Ryder. And the place it happened? Bear Gulch. That's correct. Tripp in 1851 got a new partner. Ryder went back east after his encounter. Tripp in 1851 got a new partner, M.A. Parkhurst, 22 years old, and the two together built a store in 1851. And then in 1854, this store was built, and that's the one that still stands, of course, right here in Woodside, also operated as a historic site by the San Mateo County Historical Association. And when it was complete, it was, for some years, the only general store between San Francisco and San Jose. This is Tripp's wife, Emmeline. At San Francisco, as a San Francisco County supervisor, Tripp would ride into San Francisco each Sunday, meet with the Board of Supervisors on Monday, and then come back on a Tuesday. Something happened to the three original supervisors from the peninsula, because by 1850 they were replaced. These well-known men who had great roots. Two of them actually had their places enshrined as museums and are operational even today. But by 1852, they were out, and three unknown replacements were in. And I have not been able, I've looked at those names and I tried to look them up, and they were names that sort of disappeared into history. In part, what was happening was San Francisco was being victimized by corrupt politicians and criminals who seemed to be in league. In order to remedy this, and this is State Assemblyman Horace Hawes, introduced a Consolidation Act in Sacramento. The Consolidation Act, so what does that mean? Well, it seems that every time the reformers down in San Francisco were able to clean out their city government, all the rascals were able to find new jobs in county government. And then when they'd be able to clean out the county government, guess what? They just get right back into city government. They didn't seem to be able to clean up both their local governments at the same time. So it was reasoned, why don't we consolidate then and make this one city and county of San Francisco? Is that the way it is today? Yeah, that's exactly the way it is today. And doesn't it work? Yeah, sort of. Well, anyways, that was the idea. So the reformers pressed for that. However, the corrupt elements had, guess what? Friends in Sacramento too. Yes, they said, let's have one city and county of San Francisco, but let's have two counties. Year before, locals right here in our area were seeking the creation of a new county to be called Raimondo. Sounds like a beach community in Southern California, doesn't it? And they were easily ignored, but this new group was not so easily ignored. Part of the plan of the gang up in San Francisco was to organize the new county before the locals even knew what was happening. They planned to seize 3 voting stations of 13 that would be set up and stuff ballot boxes with the names of recently arrived passengers from the Panama steamer. And all these guys that got off in San Francisco, they went straight to the gold country, but they left their names at the wharves. And so those names became San Mateo County voters. 3 election judges were assigned to watch the election. One was Dr. Tripp. Then there was Charles Clark of Colma and John Johnson of Half Moon Bay, who I don't have a picture of, but I do have a picture of his brother, the more famous James Johnston. James had come to California in 1849 and in 1852 married into one of the old Spanish families. This is Petra de Jara. Through this union, Johnston gained friendship with the old landed families, including the Miramontes clan on the San Mateo County coast. Through that relationship, he was able to obtain 1,162 acres of land south of Half Moon Bay. He then sent word to his 3 brothers, John, William, and Thomas, to bring a dairy herd out from Ohio. That's what older brothers tell younger brothers to do. The 800 head were perhaps the first dairy cattle in California. You know, you think about what they had to do. There was no railroads. There was hardly any settlements between Ohio and California. I mean, you know, crossing prairies, the Rocky Mountains. What do you think they said was the hardest part about their journey? You'll never guess. It was getting from the bay side of San Mateo County to the coast side, because there were no roads. And they would have to actually hoist cattle, you know, one by one. That's the ghost. They would actually have to hoist the cattle one by one across ravines, and it was quite the ordeal. When they got so close, they still had a lot to do. Their house, this house on the property still exists. Johnson, his brother, and his brothers built this famous salt box house reminiscent to the family's house back in Ohio. You know, when a curator from the Smithsonian Institution was traveling down Highway 1, saw this house back in the 1960s, he couldn't believe it because here's a New England-style salt box house on a slope in San Mateo County, and you can see this one. It's very clearly. You can see it very clearly from Highway 1 if you're driving south from Half Moon Bay and you look east up the hill. It still stands and it's operated from time to time as a museum. Tripp, our famous storekeeper, was watching how things were shaping up as far as the election goes, and at one point he just refused to have anything more to do with it. He wasn't going to be a judge anymore. And so that left Charles Clark, who stayed on, and also the third judge stayed on, and that was John Johnston. Now, these last two mentioned judges were also at the same time running for supervisor. And they both won. Guess what? They both. And, you know, and if you read the histories, these are two of the good guys. You know, they talk about the gangs, and then they talk about the guys that weren't in the gangs, and they were okay. They were okay locals. But how are you not in league with those San Franciscans, and you win in a fixed election? So I don't know. I mean, some of the truest, best historians have said that. Dr. Stanger, you know, who founded our history museum, and Al Hinding, who was a college professor. All of them say that they were good guys, but I don't see how they were. Well, election day, May 12th, 1856. We have an eyewitness account of what occurred at one of the three voting stations that were seized, and this was the one at Crystal Springs. There was a little community there with a hotel at Crystal Springs that was located, down Kenyatta Road, you know, past Highway 92, and in an area that be underwater today. I guess it's Lower Crystal Springs Lake is on it. So the eyewitness was a man named Gaza Haraszthy, and he testified, and this is some of his words, that almost everyone in the Crystal Springs Valley knew each other. The place was mostly made up of farmers. At the polling station, instead of familiar faces, Gaza encountered 5 election judges he did not know. All were San Francisco rough types. And I guess the intimidation of voters was apparently part of the gang's plan. Gaza voted, then stayed at the poll to observe the proceedings. He counted 30 voters, yet 297 ballots were counted. Columbus Huffaker, who lived at the W.D. Harrington's Mountain Lake Farm, about 3 miles from Crystal Springs, got to the poll at 8 in the morning, and this is all taken from testimony in court. He stayed until 3 in the afternoon. He later testified that nowhere close to 297 people voted that day. He saw several strangers around the ballot box he had never seen before. W.D. Harrington, who owned the farm, had lived in the Crystal Springs Valley since January of 1851. He felt himself well acquainted with almost everyone there. He was also present at the polling place. And like Gaza and like Huffaker, he was apparently not intimidated by what he saw, but was certain that something irregular was up. Harrington testified that after arriving at the polls and seeing the stranger, he asked who they were. They responded that they were the official election judges. Harrington only recognized one of the men who he had seen at the notorious Abbey House located at the extreme northern section of the new county. Certainly none of these 5 men were from Crystal Springs, the Crystal Springs precinct. Harrington noted that at first he saw only 4 judges, and he asked about the 5th. They then pointed to one that was asleep, snoring. This man got up, He was a pockmarked man and seemed to be sick. Harrington suggested that someone take his place, but this was refused. Later, another Valley resident, a man named Mr. Moss, recognized the pockmarked man as Liverpool Jack, a well-known San Francisco character. Harrington confirmed that no more than 25 adult men lived in the valley, and remember that women didn't have the vote. He concluded during his testimony, it is not possible that 297 votes could be compiled at Crystal Springs. Now, we don't have a photo of Gaza, but this is his father, Agnoston. And he had purchased 320 acres in the Crystal Springs Valley in 1853, now underwater too, like the hotel, to plant grapevines. In January of 1857, just a few months after the election, he and his son decided to move their operation to Sonoma County, calling the new place Buena Vista, which became California's first large-scale grape growing operation. So what's this all about, this thing that happened in the Crystal Springs Valley? Well, local political figure, pictured here with his daughter, Benjamin Lathrop, also whose house we will be operating as a house museum on our museum block coming up in October. Lathrop complained about the new Consolidation Act. He declared the compromise to have been to have one city and county government, but two counties, a bone thrown to the political clique in San Francisco and their allies. Lathrop lamented that the reformers were forced in, this was his words, quote, make terms with the thieves by adding a clause to the act cutting off about 9/10 of the county of San Francisco, establishing what is now the county of San Mateo. Chris Lilly and Billy Mulligan agreed to accept that much of the county, provided it could be arranged to organize a county government within 1 month after the passage of the act. And that's the end of the quote. And pictured here is one of the men he was talking about. That's Billy Mulligan. So this compromise, in order to have a Consolidation Act, okay, you get a consolidated San Francisco. Also for the reformers, city officials had to be bonded, and fixed expenditures were placed on 5 city departments. For the roughs, as Lathrop called them, they were given a new county to be organized without delay, one that they can control, run rackets from there, and wait for better times in security. And so who were these? Well, among them was Chris Lilly, thought to be the ringleader. He owned the Abbey House at the top of the hill at the intersection of San Jose Avenue and Mission Street in today's Daly City. As a matter of fact, Chris Lilly's political influence in Sacramento was such that his Abbey House originally was north of the county line, about 500 yards. And so he complained to his friends in Sacramento, and so they moved the county line 500 yards north so that he wouldn't have to move. Hence, Daly City is in San Mateo County. He was a famous prize fighter back on the East Coast. In 1842, he went 119 rounds. How could they allow that? With a poor man named Thomas McCoy before 2,000 spectators at Hastings, New York. He became the first American professional fighter to kill a man in the ring. Not knowing what might happen to him, he fled to England and ended up in the Mexican War in the same outfit, as a matter of fact, as Billy Mulligan. He came to California in 1850, drifted through the mining district with Mulligan and Yankee Sullivan. In 1855, he was known to be operating a cockfighting pit in San Francisco, and of course, by 1856, he's the owner of the Abbey House. Now, this man, Billy Mulligan, maybe was the toughest of the lot. He was said to weigh 120 pounds and not measure up to more than 5 feet 1 inch tall. But he was also, like Lilly, a New York prize fighter and gambler. He was a barroom brawler. In 1847, he was jailed in New York on a burglary charge, escaped, and then ended up fighting in the war with Mexico, too. In 1849, he came to California for the gold rush. He was in frequent trouble as a known ruffian. In February of 1851, he shot and killed a gambler named William Anderson at Sonora. In the fall of 1851, he fought a duel with a hard character named Jimmy Douglas. In November of 51, he was wounded in a shootout at the Bella Union Saloon in San Francisco. Only 6 days later, he's wounded again, this time as a bystander watching a gunfight. Once in San Francisco, he became involved in politics. He organized his friends into parties, and they sold nominations, quotes, nominations, to the highest bidder. He once received $28,000 for one of these nominations from his gang of bullies. He became a loyal Senator David Broderick man, and they specialized in bullying voters, fighting with political opponents. Broderick then rewarded Billy. He made him tax collector for San Francisco. And at the time of this 1856 incident, he had been made San Francisco jailkeeper. Another man that was in this group of trying to seize control of early San Mateo County was the past governor of California, a man named John McDougall. And we rely on Herbert Howe Bancroft to give us a biography of McDougall. And this comes right out of this 19th century history. Ex-Governor John McDougall. He joined forces to have Belmont declared county seat. He was considered to be a gentlemanly drunkard and a Democratic politician in the order for which California was destined to become somewhat unpleasantly notorious. And in a further description, in a footnote, Bancroft's footnotes are always priceless. That's where the good stuff is. He writes, John McDougall was born in Ohio in 1818 and in boyhood removed to the vicinity of Indianapolis, Indiana, where he was superintendent of the state prison in 1846. He was a captain in the Mexican War in which he distinguished himself. In 1849, he came to California with his brother George and served in the Constitutional Convention. He was fine-looking and adhered to the old style of ruffled shirt front, buff vest, and pantaloons, and blue coat with brass buttons. He used to say that there were two beings of whom he stood in awe, God Almighty and Mrs. McDougall. The latter always treated him with a patient kindness, although often compelled to bring him home from a midnight debauch. When he was afterwards in the U.S. Senate, he made but one speech in preparation for which he was 3 weeks in sobering it off. On several occasions, he attempted suicide. Although not at that stage of his ruinous career when elected lieutenant governor, he was seldom fit for the discharge of his duties. Yet, such was the influence of his naturally genial and generous deportment, cultivated mind, and brilliant social talents that only his political enemies, and not always those, could bring themselves to treat him with the contempt another man in his position might have received. So the election. Before the local residents know what's even happening, like Gaza and others in the Crystal Springs area, the Consolidation Act was to go into effect in July. Election is, though, called for in May. On election day, 3 of the county's 13 stations were seized. As you know, at Laguna Precinct in the Crystal Springs Valley, which had no more than 25 eligible voters, 297 ballots were counted. At Chris Lilly's Abbey House, 500 ballots were tallied in a precinct of no more than 50 voters. In Belmont, votes were compiled in the home of Governor McDougall. No local witnesses were even allowed to monitor the count. All the ballots were then gathered, tabulated at the American Hotel in Redwood City. Mulligan's men brandished knives and guns and is said to have intimidated the 2 election judges, John Johnston of Half Moon Bay and Charles Clark Coleman. But were they intimidated? They won. So I still can't figure that. Out of a total population of 2,500 people, 1,700 votes were counted. Now, women couldn't vote, kids can't vote. 1,700 ballots out of a population of 2,500. Bernard Mulligan, Billy Mulligan's brother, is elected sheriff. Chris Lilly's bartender, Robert Gray, is county clerk. Other gang members were made county attorney, assessor, treasurer, as well as assuming one of the 3 supervisorial seats. So if you don't count Johnston and Clark, I actually think they got all 3. But, well, locals were up in arms, some of them anyways. Some honest men did make office. Ben Fox of Redwood City won as judge, and he spearheaded an immediate investigation into the election. John Johnson, of course, won, and that was considered to be a victory. Charles Clark beat out a guy named James Casey. Now, James Casey was absolutely enraged because he was a member of the gang. And yet, Charles Clark got the bid, which means that somehow he was undone and was pretty upset about it. 2 days after the election, actually on the very day that the results were announced, James King of William, and this is James King of William, editor of the San Francisco Bulletin, ran a story on James Casey describing how he had a record and he had served time at Sing Sing Penitentiary back in New York. Casey went to his office, threatened him, and an hour later, at 5 p.m., mortally wounded him in the streets of San Francisco. Casey turned himself in to the sheriff, a guy named Scannell. They could hear at that time the bell of the old 1851 Vigilance Committee starting to ring. Scannell slipped Casey a revolver for self-protection and shoved him into a cell for safekeeping. That night, a contingent of San Franciscan men gathered to talk about what to do. There's no question that San Francisco was a wide open city, far too lenient on criminal activities of all sorts. However, there was something about the killing of a newspaper editor that felt particularly wrong. It represented the silencing of a voice of reform. It seemed un-American. Many of them remembered what they had done in 1851 when they had felt pushed to the limit. They had organized the Vigilance Committee and chased 2 criminal gangs out of the city who had been terrorizing residents. Since that time, the efforts of that committee have become legendary, lionizing veterans of those days like William Tell Coleman, now stepping forward to offer leadership again. The next day, on May 15th, the Vigilance Committee of 1856 began to recruit and organize itself. It ended up being huge, some 8,000 strong, probably the largest vigilance committee ever assembled in American history. They far outnumbered its 1851 predecessor, and this group was far more open about its membership. The original 1851 society was a secret one. These guys were very much out front with what they were doing. They called themselves the People, and they were going to break the hold of the political clique and their criminal allies that had taken control of San Francisco. And so the men that are pictured here were their uniformed sharpshooters. And this was their fort. It was nicknamed Fort Gunnybags. They called it Fort Vigilance. And the Gunnybags, because you could see it's got the sacks in front of it. It was a warehouse that they had converted into a fort. And this structure stood on Sacramento Street near Front, if you know the city. Friday night, May 16th, 2,500 to 3,000 vigilantes surrounded the jail and demanded that Casey and another target, a guy named Charles Cora, be turned over to them. On May 20th, James King of William died from his wound. On May 22nd, the committee found and convicted both Casey and Cora of their crimes and were hanged. Mulligan and 15 others were run out of California. Benjamin Fox, our first San Mateo County judge, opened his court on June 10th in Belmont, still the temporary county seat. Benjamin Lathrop, going back to our hero, hired attorneys to represent those who had lost in the fixed election. No witnesses appeared for the defense. On that, they'd all been chased out of California by the vigilantes. On that same day, Fox found, quote, frauds had been committed at Crystal Springs and Lily's and Belmont, and that the judgment of the court was returns from those three precincts were corrupt and void. He further found Belmont not to be the county seat, and that honor would belong to Redwood City. Now, there's a legacy to this. I mean, it sounds like this is a happy ending, but not there yet. Now a very rural county existed adjacent to a very urban one. And as wide open as San Francisco was, if you could not get away with something in the city, then you just crossed the county line, where there was no law enforcement at all. Okay, and as an example, in 1859, there was an incident where a California Supreme Court Justice, David Terry, and that's David Terry there, and a United States Senator, David Broderick, became embroiled in an argument over slavery. Now, dueling had been outlawed in the state's constitution of 1850. So in order to settle the dispute, they merely crossed the county line and shot it out in today's Daly City on land now a golf course. Terry killed Broderick in one of the most famous duels in Western history. For decades, this legacy of corruption stuck. Things became exasperated in the 1920s with prohibition. Rum running off the coast was rampant. Stills were ubiquitous throughout San Mateo County. And it seems every large building served as a speakeasy for at least a time. Things became worse in the 1930s with gambling problems. And John Marchbank, who is kind of drawn up here of Daly City, became a ringleader. One gambler from Hillsborough declared at this point in our county's history that it was the most corrupt in all of California. So, how did this all work out? How did we get to clean old San Mateo County today? Well, you'll have to read all about it.
Okay, everyone, thank you for coming this evening, and thank Mitch. You know, the San Mateo Museum is really a fascinating place. They've got a lot of projects. They're working on the Carriage House, so they're going to have a lot of things happening. It's well worth your time.
I'd like to invite you all to our grand opening of the Carriage House. 2 years ago, I came to you and I said, hey, we're thinking about building this thing. So this 15,000 square foot addition to our San Mateo County History Museum, we're going to celebrate its opening on October 3rd. So please put that down on your calendars and come join us. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you again for coming this evening. Remind you that next month we have the jazz band from the elementary school coming. And just to end up everything, Will Rogers, an American humorist, once said that American politicians are the best in the world because they make the most money. And that may still be true. So have a good evening. Thank you again for coming.